Hi everyone. So I'm Suleiman Charles Nee from Education Changemakers, and today I want to talk to you a bit about feedback, but in particular, the connection between giving good feedback to students and your differentiation strategies. I'll just start with an acknowledgement of country and acknowledging the local custodians of all the different countries that we meet on, both today, whether that's here in Melbourne or wherever that you're watching this, and paying respect to the profound contribution that the first Australians have made as elders, as storytellers and holders of the deep wisdom of this land here in Australia. This is a wonderful painting that we always show at acknowledgement. It symbolizes us in the middle there. That's where wisdom is coming together. And then it also symbolizes the many schools and teachers and educationalists all around that central circle. And as you can see, the footprints of wisdom coming from those schools into our central circle, and also leading from the wisdom that arises amongst us in that middle circle, going back out to the schools and the teachers as well. And thanks to Tristan Dougie, who did that brilliant painting. Let's start off with a check-in today. And I'm asking you with this check-in, what would you say to a new teacher are the most important aspects of assessment? If you're sitting there with a couple of other people doing this work, this module, have a chat to them about that. If not, just reflect on that question. What would you say to a new teacher are the most important aspects of assessment? I'll give you 3 minutes to do that. Good, so I'll move on now. If you want to keep talking, just click the pause button. So in today's session, these are our aims. I'd like to review how feedback can be effectively used as a differentiation tool. And I'd like to discuss some of those strategies. So specific differentiation and feedback strategies that you can hopefully take into your classroom straight after this session or tomorrow. So the connection between feedback and differentiation is pretty obvious for teachers. I think we know what it is. Basically, when we give feedback, it allows us to differentiate our teaching. It allows us to say exactly what we need to say to that individual student that is right for that individual student at that moment so that they can improve their learning. So in many ways, it's the essential aspect of differentiation, is the absolute core of that. But what it relies on, of course, is our knowledge of our students. And that's one of our key criteria as teachers. Our standard number 1 says know your students and how they learn. And 1.5 is differentiate teaching to meet the specific learning needs of students across the full range of abilities. So we can't know our students without effective assessment practices. So this idea of differentiation is so connected to assessment and the effective assessments that we use, and then of course the feedback that we then give to those students to improve in their next learning cycle. And I think that's seeing that triangle, seeing that connection is the core point of the connection between feedback and differentiation. So feedback is one of those key teaching tools that we need to use. And it's not just me saying that. It is also Hattie. I know he always gets brought up in these talks, but he said some pretty important things. This idea to give better feedback to students is what he has seen in all his research as having the biggest impact on quality of education for students. So these dollops of feedback that he calls them, these constant injections of feedback into our students' learning, is what helps them to improve. It starts with the students knowing learning intentions. And many schools have done a lot of work about clarifying those learning intentions at the beginning of lessons, putting them into unit plans, etc., etc. So that's what it starts with, because if you don't know what, as a teacher, we really want the students to learn, and if they don't know what they're expected to learn, it's very difficult at that point then to give really quality feedback so that they can actually improve. The students should know how they're currently traveling, how are they going, as Hattie would say, and where to next. Lynn Sharratt said some very similar things to Hattie. Nothing else matters in teaching and learning as much as quality assessment. That is, data that informs and differentiates instruction for each learner in a never-ending cycle of inquiry to discover what works best. So Yes, the student needs to know how he or she is going and what they need to do next to improve, and they get that from feedback. But secondly, we also need to work out from the assessment that we've been doing as teachers, we need to know how we then change, modify, differentiate our instruction to students. So again, that's why the assessment, again, as Lynn Sharrett would call it, is so connected to learning intentions. If you've had these intentions and then you assess the students and they haven't met what you deemed as the success criteria, where they're showing you that they've actually learned something, that immediately tells you as a teacher that you can modify your teaching, that you need to change some of the things that you're actually doing in your instruction so that the students are actually doing better. And it also immediately helps you to train the students to actually do that themselves. So that peer assessment, that self-assessment process as part of your teaching and learning is also incredibly important. And that all comes through the descriptive feedback that you're giving those students. It all comes through a reactionary process where you're taking in the learning that they're doing and you're feeding back to them about their progress. Most teachers out there nowadays would be saying, yeah, of course, this is what we know. This is not rocket science, Charles. You're telling me what I already know. And I suppose Hattie and Lynn Sharrett are reacting to a world of about 30 or 40 years ago, where many teachers still saw their role in this very Aristotelian way of, I have the knowledge and I'm putting it into you, take it or leave it. And I think teaching and learning has changed significantly over the last 20 to 30 years. And it's much more about a process that exists between the student and the teacher. It's much more empowering for the students, where they get to actually set some goals themselves. They get to lead their own learning. And it's much more about, as teachers, reacting to the needs of the students in front of us, rather than having a textbook or a unit plan of the information that we need to cram into our students. Learning has become a more dynamic process in schools more recently, where we're thinking much more about how students are reacting to what we're doing and then modifying what we're doing in terms of their reactions. And that's what this differentiation of feedback really means. It's all about formative action. And Dylan Wiliam, of course, is a bit of a doyen when it comes to talking about assessment for learning, or as he would call it, formative assessment, where it's all about using assessment to inform us as teachers as to the actions we need to take, and using assessment to inform our students as to the things they need to do to take the next step in their learning. So let's hear Dylan Wiliam just talk a little bit about this from one of his talks way back, I think in 2004, when he said this.
So we could call all these things formative assessment or assessment for learning, whether it's the annual cycle of reviewing test scores and checking to see whether there's nothing wrong in looking through your kids' exam results, looking at their papers, seeing that they consistently missed a topic and looking back and saying, the reason for that is we didn't teach it at all. Now, that's a good thing to do, isn't it? But it's not going to make a big difference. The really big effect sizes that we find in the research literature are when you do this stuff here, the minute by minute and day by day formative assessment. If you let the kids leave the classroom before you've used the evidence about their achievement that you've acquired to make a difference to your teaching, you're already playing catch up. And if you haven't made an adjustment by the next time they reappear in your classroom, it's probably too late. Yeah? So basically, you do not need to be able to write to do good formative assessment. It's about that minute by minute and day by day adjustment of your teaching. The reason is that all the long cycle stuff does is monitor student achievement and possibly align your curriculum so that if you're not teaching stuff you should be teaching, it tells you that. That's helpful, but it's weak. Medium cycle, you might get the students involved, you might get the students understanding the success criteria, that might be helpful, and you might get better teachers thinking about learning. But here's the point, here's the trap. Here's the trap I think we've been in for the last 30 years. Changing what teachers think doesn't benefit students until it changes what teachers do. And as you change what teachers do in classrooms, you will have no impact on student outcomes. And most of the professional development we've had in this country over the last 30 years has been designed to change teachers' thinking. Basically, we've been trying to get teachers to think their way into a new way of acting. And what we're going to focus on today is getting teachers to act their way into a new way of thinking.
So what are we actually going to do? I think that's a great question Dylan William poses us at the end of that little segment. And those ideas of the long cycle and the medium cycle when it comes to formative assessment, of changing things, looking at data, are fine and they're great and they do have a positive impact going forward. But the really positive impact, as he mentions there, is those little actions that you take with those students in your classroom. It's quite empowering, actually, as a teacher. It's not something that the senior exec is going to do. It's not something that they're going to go away, come up with this data and come up with big holistic school plans that are going to make a massive difference. What's going to make a massive difference to your students is that individual action that you do in your classroom tomorrow. When you hear that a student doesn't understand something, the action that you then take, having heard that, reteaching it in a different way, changing your plans so that tomorrow you're not going to do what it says on the unit plan because you've heard that the students don't understand the point that you taught today. So you need to go back over it in a different way. It's those really basic, tiny little actions, that ability to adjust your teaching to what you've noticed, that's going to make massive impact. And similarly, it's the feedback, the little bits of feedback that you give to your students that are also going to have a huge impact. So in terms of feedback, what does it need to be? Well, it needs to be frequent. Exactly as Dylan William just said, you need to make sure that the feedback you're giving to them is constant. It's daily. It's within every single lesson. A student should be walking away thinking, oh, the teacher told me some area I can improve. Now, some of that can be whole class feedback. So that's fine. But some of that does need to be individual. So don't think, oh my God, that means I've got to mark a mountain of books every single lesson, every single day. It's impossible. But it could mean making sure you plan lessons where you're walking around the classroom, looking over the student's shoulder and helping him or her with individual problems, individual questions, individual sentences and bits of writing. That idea of frequency, where you have a culture in your classroom where the student's constantly being informed positively about how they can improve, that's the culture that we want to aim for. Clarity is also massively important. And in the past, as an English teacher in particular, we can be a bit wishy-washy. Oh, your writing doesn't flow. You need to be clear. Your writing needs to use different types of sentences, compound, complex, and simple, for it to flow better. Next time you write, make sure you're using more complex sentences. It's that sort of level of clarity that the students can actually act upon. This is an interesting one. Feedback also needs to be engaging. If it's just always a note at the bottom of their work, they're soon going to stop reading that note and just look at the grade. So how can you make your feedback more engaging? We'll talk about some strategies later, but that's something for you to consider. How do you know that students are actually listening to the feedback or reading the feedback that you're giving them? We've mentioned twice, both through Hattie and Lynn Sharrett, learning intention. So obviously the feedback has to be linked back to that. If you set a learning intention, make sure that the feedback is linked to it. And that's an interesting one with differentiation, because the learning intentions are often quite holistic. And it might be that individual students are going to achieve certain aspects of that learning intentions when it comes to differentiation. So the feedback also needs to take into account that. And the last thing I would say is repetitive. And this is slightly different to frequent. By repetitive, I mean, when you tell a student to do something or change something, they will make the same mistake again tomorrow. They will make the same mistake again in a year's time. They will make the same mistake again in 4 years' time. Because we're adults, even if we've been driving for years and years, we still make a mistake on the road. We still have car accidents. So the feedback will often be repetitive, and that's an attitudinal thing for us as teachers. We can't get frustrated at that. We've got to just give that same feedback again if it's required. Maybe we think about how can we engage the kids more and give it in a more engaging way so it sticks, but sometimes it will stick and then they'll still forget it. So that idea of frequency, yes, but repetitive, it might be the same thing, and being okay with that, I suppose, going forward. So for the next 3 minutes, it'd be good if you think to yourself, well, how am I currently giving feedback to my students? Am I just writing a note, a comment at the bottom of their work? Am I trying to do something with technology where I'm recording a little comment and then they can access that through Seesaw or one of these programs? how am I currently giving feedback? And have a little chat about how effective you actually think that is. 3 minutes to talk about that, and then we'll resume. So press pause if you want to keep talking. The power of feedback is, as we know, well proven. We've looked at some of the research done by Hattie and Lynn Sharrett, and we can really see that power in their research and their sort of data, or in Hattie's case, metadata analysis. But it's great to see an actual example of it as well. You may have seen this before, and if you have, feel free to skip over this part of the video. But this is Austin's butterfly, and well, it speaks for itself. Have a look at this. This is a wonderful example of feedback.
What would you guys say to teachers if they're not getting high quality work? Could they learn something from this? And what would you say to them that they could do differently in their classrooms? This is a story called Austin's Butterfly. And it's a true story about a first grade boy, and his name is Austin, and he goes to school, or used to go to school, in a town called Boise, Idaho. And in his class in Boise, Idaho, they were studying butterflies, and he had to do a project. His job in first grade was to draw a butterfly, and this is the butterfly that he picked. Austin had to use this photograph as his model, and he had to draw an accurate scientific drawing of this butterfly. This is called a tiger swallowtail.
I knew it!
Can you tell, Toby, why it's called tiger?
Because it kind of has the stripes of the tiger right there.
Good. So here was Austin's job. He was supposed to do a scientific drawing of that butterfly. But remember, Austin was only in first grade. And you know what he did? He forgot to look like a scientist carefully. He got his paper and he just started to draw the image of a butterfly that he had in his head. And he wasn't looking like a scientist. And so this is what he drew.
Whoa.
It's not bad, and it is a butterfly. But does it look exactly like this?
No.
No, it doesn't yet. It doesn't look exactly like this yet. Luckily, this wasn't a regular school where Austin went. It was an expeditionary learning school, just like Przemysl School. And so they didn't look at this and say, good, Austin, you're done. They said, Austin, good start. Now we can start giving you critique so you can do a second draft and make it better, and a third draft and make it better, and you can make it much, much closer to this. And he was ready to go. All of the first graders in his critique group sat on the floor like you guys are, and they decided to split their advice into two kinds. First, just the shape of the wings. And then when the shape was right, they'd give him advice about the pattern inside the wings. Alia, what would you say?
You can make it much pointier.
Good. These wings could be much pointier. Who else would add something? Atak, what would you say?
About the angle, because not to be mean about
Yes.
the angle, it's just not exact. So
Okay, so show me. Come on up here, Atak. Show me what you would ask him to do slightly differently.
like to make it a little longer.
Longer where? Draw where you would do it.
Right there.
Okay, so pull this out longer.
Yeah.
That's very specific, Atak. Thank you. Jamila, what would you say?
It's like triangle.
Good. Jamila, I love that. So you're saying more like a triangle shape. And I agree. Well, you know what? Those first graders came up with most of those same ideas. And you know what Austin said? He said, okay, I'll go try. And he went back to his seat and he drew this.
Wow.
Does this look more like a triangle?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he go out further, like Atak was suggesting?
Yes.
Did he add some jaggedness here,
Yes.
like Cindy? Did he get rid of that bottom thing?
Yes.
So he did listen to his friends and he made it better. It's not perfect. Toby, what would you say?
I'd say don't put those little tail things so pointed in. I'd say put them more pointed down.
Good. Okay. And Ethan, what would you say?
I think you should make the wings like this, not like this.
Okay. He listened to his friends and they said, this is really a lot better, Austin. That second draft really is better.
Yeah, maybe you can make a third one.
Good. Maybe he could make a third draft. And so he did this draft.
That's his third draft.
That's his third draft, Hadley. That's just right. Elijah, what do you notice there?
Well, one wing's more pointed than the other, and that side is a little bit higher than the others.
Good. Coburn?
Right here, it doesn't have the inside thing still.
Ah, okay. Needs a little bit more of that notch. So do you think maybe he should do a fourth draft?
Yeah.
Well, that's just what he said. He said, shoot, okay, I got round again. I'll go back and do a fourth draft.
Listen.
He listened. Does it look more even like Elijah was suggesting?
Yes.
Yeah. And does it look like it's coming out a little sharper, like
Yes.
Cindy was suggesting? And like Attack was saying, it's a little, the angle looks a little better. So now Austin was feeling really good. He said, am I ready to add some pattern? And they said, okay, why don't you try adding some of the pattern? And he did.
He's good at it. He is so good.
And then they said, Austin, you're ready for color.
Really?
Let's look at his last draft.
Wow.
And what do you think? Did it come out really good?
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me show you where he started, just to give you a quick reminder. And then, what do you think about how much progress he made? And Tack, what would you say about his progress?
He made like a lot of progress. He persevered doing it. His friends were honest with him.
What was it about the kinds of advice that they gave that allowed him to get better each time? Hassan?
Well, they told him what was wrong about it.
Did they say it's just wrong, or were they more specific?
They were more specific, but they weren't mean about it.
Great.
He
Hadley.
made 6 drafts.
And so is that something that other kids should learn from?
Yeah.
What should we learn from that?
He can make other drafts if it's not right.
Good. So if it's not right, you can keep doing more drafts to make it better.
Great. So it's a brilliant bit of advice, and it's been around for a long time now. That was mid-1990s that Austin's Butterfly was published, and it's great just to look up. You can watch way more about it, but it's so clear the power of feedback in that little video. And yes, of course, it's primary kids, but it's just so clear about what feedback can do. So feedback is for the teacher, for us to change, but feedback is also for the learners. And you can just see the power of differentiating instruction because the feedback is personalized to that individual learner. If you've watched that little video, have an opportunity now just to chat to the people around you about when you've nailed it. When have you had a similar experience to that Austin's Butterfly? When have you given some feedback to a student and then they've come back in with something else that has been vastly better, vastly improved, and you've thought, yes, they've actually listened to my teaching for the first time ever. And so tell your friends about that. I've given you 5 minutes to do that because it's always nice to share some best practice. Obviously, if you're watching this by yourself, that's fine. You can just reflect on that. But otherwise, have a chat to the people around you about when you've nailed it. Good. So pause the video if you want to keep chatting, and then we'll keep going. So how do we do it? The last section of this little presentation is very much around nice, effective strategies for you to be able to give feedback to your students, for you to go away so that at the end of this session today, you think to yourself, in tomorrow's lesson with my year 8s, I can do one of these strategies. Remember, these strategies are linked to what feedback needs to be: frequent, clear, engaging, linked to our learning intentions, and sometimes repetitive. First of all is questioning. Really have a think about how are you questioning your students. That's certainly something that you can be frequent when you're giving feedback. So when you question them, they'll give you an answer. The most obvious way of providing feedback is responding directly to that answer there. And the amount of lessons observations I've done where I've seen a teacher ask a question, I've seen the student answer the question, and then the teacher tends to move on directly to the next question that was in his mind, rather than genuinely listening to that question, that answer to the question that they first asked. So I think that's about having that confidence of the lesson doesn't have to end up being exactly as I planned. Whatever they answer in this question can help direct me in my next steps in this lesson. So when you're asking questions, listen to the answers and then frame your next question based around the answer that's actually been provided rather than what was already in your mind. Redrafting is the next one, and pretty obvious one as a strategy for free feedback. Make sure, and you've seen in Austin's butterfly how effective that can be, but make sure that you're actually planning in that opportunity for redrafting. If you look at this sort of assessment for learning flow map that I found as an image, it's just online, you'll probably find it as well. But when the teacher provides that learning, the student answers with activities, does some sort of assessment. After that formative assessment, it goes off in two directions. Yes, it informs us as teachers for how we can keep improving, but also it loops back into the student redoing something. So give the student the opportunity, that feedback loop number 2, to redo something, to prove that they've actually listened to your feedback. Once you give them the feedback, let them redo it as well. Another really simple one is entry and exit tickets. These are little games that you can play. You can literally use a ticket, or a post-it note's always good fun, where they get to write down as they walk into the classroom what they know from last lesson, or maybe some prior knowledge if you're starting up a new topic. And as they leave the lesson, they also get to write down what they've learned in that lesson today. Or you ask them a really specific question, quiz question that is designed to test a key element of their learning in the lesson. You then get an opportunity to tally them up, have a quick look through those exit tickets or the entry tickets to see how effective the teaching has been, to see where the students are sitting in terms of their understanding. So that's a great strategy. Mentioned as well by Lynn Sharrett is the peer and self-assessment. Obviously, this can't just happen. You don't just go and say, oh, now you've got to do peer assessment. Now you do self-assessment, assess your own work. You have to provide the students with some sort of scaffold to be able to do that. What are they looking for? Hey, the literacy progressions can be really effective for this. You know, the language that's used in literacy progressions are great. It can be great for, if you tailor it a little bit for students, for looking at where the students have taken that next step. But there's a lot of good learning progressions and good criteria and those sorts of objectives that you can use for that peer and self-assessment. Just don't forget to give it to the students first so that they're actually really effectively using it. And the other one, to make it more engaging, is this use of different mediums. I've seen some great use on iPads of teachers leaving spoken comments to work rather than written comments. I've also seen some pretty cool stuff done on technology where you're using Prezi to zoom into different examples in work or model work to actually really give clear feedback about what students have actually done. So there's plenty of potential out there for some creative ways to give feedback rather than just writing a comment at the bottom of their work. Another nice, easy one that I've used in the past is stickers. Get some nice stickers made that lay out the feedback with an aspect of some sort of praise and then some targets for improvement underneath. And then the teachers just can fill in those different things. Other departments I've seen have been sticking in the key learning intentions or success criteria into the front of the students' books, and then you're able to tick those off as you actually reach them, or circle them if there's areas of concern. So there's so many different ways that you can get a bit creative with the feedback that you're actually giving your students. So the key question to ask yourself as a teacher is, do all your students know where they're at in their own learning journey? Because if they don't, then you haven't actually differentiated. You haven't met standard 1 of knowing your students. So it's very much about, for differentiation, how can I make sure that each individual student knows exactly where they are in their learning at this moment and what they need to do to improve, to take the next step in their learning. And coming up with systems that are logistically practical and possible that allows you to do that, because you can't sit there and teach individuals or lesson. So could that be stickers? Could that be some recordings? Whatever that system looks like, that's fine. But coming up with some of those practical systems that allow students to know where they're individually at so that the learning is truly differentiated. As a checkout, think about this question. What can you commit to next week? So you know what you're teaching next week. You know what it is that you're going to have to deliver. But if we've now today talked about the importance of feedback when it comes to effective differentiating, what can you do? What can you commit to in next week's planning that will give that effective feedback to the students? Is it just that you look at your plan and you think, maybe I'm rushing through things, I need to plan an extra lesson in there to allow me to effectively question? Is it that you can let the students lead their own learning a little bit more and lead their own assessment and self-assessment? Is it that you could, have a play with some technology when it comes to responding to an assignment or a task or an activity that students have done for you? So have a think about what you can actually commit to, because as both Hattie and Sharrett, and as you saw in Austin's Butterfly, feedback is the most important thing when it comes to teaching and learning, and also has the biggest impact when it comes to effective knowing your students and differentiation. Thanks very much for listening today. Hope you found it useful and helpful. See you later.